I was seated next to the kitchen door at my sister-in-law's wedding, while the rest of the family sat under crystal chandeliers and soft music, and when I tried to move closer, my mother-in-law gently stopped me and said, "Those seats are for real family." Like I had somehow married into the wrong life. My husband didn't defend me. He just adjusted his tie and looked away. And when the seating chart was announced, my name wasn't even printed. It was handwritten at the bottom in smaller ink, like an afterthought, like I didn't belong there at all. And I remember standing there for a second, holding my clutch, feeling every eye slide past me as if I were invisible. And in that moment, something inside me went very still. Because this wasn't new, it just finally happened in a room full of witnesses. And if this story speaks to you, only if it truly resonates with you, take a second to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from and your local time. Because I always read those messages, and they remind me I wasn't as alone as I felt that night. My name is Rachel Carter. I'm 42 years old, and this was the night my husband's family tried to quietly erase me in front of 200 guests, not with shouting, not with a scene, but with something colder, something more precise, the kind of silence that tells you exactly where you stand without anyone needing to say it out loud. And if you had walked into that ballroom, you would have thought everything was perfect. White roses on every table, gold chairs lined in perfect rows, waiters moving like clockwork with trays of champagne, laughter echoing from one side of the room to the other, and at the center of it all, Emily, my sister-in-law, glowing in her white dress, greeting guests like she owned the entire night. And maybe she did, because in that family, status was everything, and I had never quite fit into their version of it. I wore a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, nothing meant to draw attention, just something comfortable after flying in from out of state earlier that morning. And when I first walked in, a few relatives gave me polite smiles, the kind that never quite reached their eyes, and others didn't even bother. They just looked through me like I was part of the background, like another chair or another glass on the table. And I told myself it didn't matter, that I was here for my husband, that I could get through one night, just one more night of small comments and quiet exclusions. But then I noticed the seating arrangement, the way every Carter family member was placed close to the stage, close to the spotlight, and my name was nowhere. Not until I found it at the very end, near the service doors where the kitchen noise bled into the music, where plates clinked and staff moved in and out without stopping. And for a second, I thought it was a mistake, something simple, something fixable. So I turned to Daniel, my husband, standing right beside me, and I said softly, "I think they put me in the wrong section." And he didn't even look at the chart. He just said, "It's fine, Rachel. Just sit where they told you." Like it wasn't worth questioning, like I wasn't worth the correction. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't an accident. This was a decision, a quiet, deliberate line drawn in front of everyone, and I could feel it settling in. Not as anger, not yet, but as something heavier, something colder, because I knew exactly what they were doing. And more importantly, I knew exactly what I was about to do next. But to understand why I stayed, why I didn't walk out of that room, you have to go back to where all of this really began. The first time I met Daniel's family, I remember standing in the doorway of their house with a small box of cookies in my hands, something simple I had baked myself. And his mother looked at it, then at me, and said, "Oh, how homemade." Like it was a polite way of saying it was not enough. And Daniel squeezed my hand back then, told me not to overthink it, told me that was just how she was. But over time I started to see a pattern, not loud, not obvious, just small things that stacked up until they felt impossible to ignore, like the way they would switch topics when I spoke, or how they would introduce Daniel as our son, and then pause before mentioning me at all, or the way every family event seemed to have an invisible line that I was never allowed to cross. And I told myself it would get better, that marriages take time, that families take time, that if I stayed calm and respectful, they would eventually see me as one of their own. But years passed, and nothing really changed. It just became quieter, more subtle, like they had perfected the art of making me feel out of place without ever saying it directly. And Daniel, he never argued with them, not once. He would say things like, "They will come around," or "It is not worth the fight." And I wanted to believe him, I really did, because loving him felt easy, but being part of his world never did. And there was one moment I still think about sometimes, About 2 years into our marriage, when his sister Emily hosted a small dinner party at her apartment, and I arrived early to help, thinking maybe if I showed effort, things would shift, but when I walked into the kitchen, I found everything already prepared, perfectly arranged, and Emily smiled at me in that careful way of hers and said, "Oh, you did not have to come early. We already handled everything." And then she handed me a tray of glasses and asked if I could just keep them filled, like I was staff, not family, and I remember standing there by the counter, pouring drinks, listening to their conversations from a distance, watching them laugh about vacations I was never invited to and memories I was never part of. And I told myself again that it was temporary, that I just needed to be patient. But patience started to feel a lot like invisibility. And somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting things to change. I stopped trying to fit into spaces that clearly were not meant for me, and instead I focused on my own life, my own work, the part of me they never asked about, the part Daniel barely talked about to them, not because he was hiding it, but because in that family, it simply did not matter. And maybe that was the real reason I stayed quiet at the wedding, sitting near the kitchen while everyone else celebrated, because I had seen this before, just never on this scale, never with so many witnesses, never with my place made this clear, this final, this public. And as I sat there, listening to the faint echo of laughter and the sharper sound of plates behind me, I realized something I had been avoiding for years. This was not about misunderstanding. This was not about time. This was exactly where they believed I belonged. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to prove them wrong. I just watched, calm, still, waiting, because what they did not know was that this night was not going to end the way they expected. The music started to rise as the ceremony began, soft piano notes filling the room while guests leaned forward in their seats. And from where I sat near the kitchen doors, I could see everything just slightly off-center, like I was watching a life that was never meant to include me. Waiters moved in and out behind me, the faint scent of food drifting into the air. And every now and then, the door would swing open just enough to remind me exactly where I had been placed, but I stayed still, hands resting calmly on my lap, eyes focused on the front, because leaving would have been easier, and I was done choosing easy. Emily stood at the end of the aisle, glowing under the lights, her dress catching every reflection, her smile perfectly practiced, and Daniel stood a few rows ahead of me with his family, shoulders relaxed, completely at ease, like nothing about this night felt wrong to him, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and for a brief second, I wondered if maybe I had imagined all of it, if maybe I was overthinking, until I noticed something small, something most people would miss, the way one of the older guests, a man in a dark suit with a posture too straight to be casual, he turned his head slightly when he passed by me earlier, his eyes lingering just a second longer than polite, like he was trying to place me. And then there was the waiter, a young guy carrying a tray of champagne, who paused when he reached my table and said, "Ma'am," in a tone that did not match the way he addressed anyone else, not dismissive, not rushed, but careful, respectful. And when I thanked him, he nodded in a way that felt almost formal before moving on. Small moments, easy to ignore, but they stacked quietly in the back of my mind. And then I saw him, the groom, Michael Hayes, standing at the front, adjusting his cufflinks as the officiant spoke, his expression calm, focused, but every so often, his eyes would scan the room, not nervously, not distracted, just observant, like someone trained to notice details others would miss. And when his gaze passed over my section, it slowed, just for a fraction of a second, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. And then it moved on, like he was not sure what he had seen. The ceremony continued. Vows were exchanged, voices steady, rehearsed, the kind of words people say when everything looks perfect from the outside. And the room leaned into it, guests smiling, some wiping away quiet tears, cameras flashing softly from the sides. And I sat there, completely still, feeling something shift in the air, not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle tension building underneath the surface, like the moment before a storm when everything feels too calm. And as the officiant reached the part where the rings were to be exchanged, the room seemed to hold its breath. Emily extended her hand, her smile unwavering. Michael reached for the ring, and then he stopped. Not suddenly, not in a way that caused panic, just a pause, small but unmistakable. his hand hovering in the air for a second longer than it should have, his expression changing slightly, not confusion, not exactly, but recognition struggling to form. His eyes shifted again, scanning the room more deliberately this time, slower, searching, until they found me. And when they did not move away, and in that moment, everything around me seemed to quiet down. The music, the whispers, even the movement behind me, as if the entire room had unknowingly stepped into the same pause. And I did not look away. I simply met his gaze, calm, steady, waiting, because I knew that look. I had seen it before, the exact moment when memory catches up with reality, when something buried rises to the surface, and for a brief second, it felt like time stretched, like the entire ceremony was suspended between what everyone expected to happen and what was about to happen next. For a moment, no one understood what was happening. The officiant paused mid-sentence, Emily's hand still extended in the air, her smile beginning to tighten at the edges, and Michael did not move. He just kept looking at me, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if confirming something he did not fully trust yet. And then he lowered his hand slowly, the ring still between his fingers, and took a small step back, the kind of movement that is quiet but impossible to ignore. A ripple passed through the front rows, subtle at first, people shifting in their seats, glancing at each other, trying to understand why the ceremony had stopped, and I could feel the change before anyone said a word, that invisible shift in attention, like a spotlight turning without warning. And then Michael spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough that every voice in the room fell away. "Excuse me," he said, his tone controlled, steady, but carrying something heavier underneath, something that made people listen. And he turned fully now, no longer facing the altar, but facing the room, his eyes searching again until they landed on me. And this time, he did not hesitate. "Ma'am," he said first, almost carefully, like he was testing the memory. And then there was a pause, just long enough to stretch the tension tighter. "Commander Carter, is that you?" And the words did not echo. They did not need to, because the silence that followed was complete, absolute, the kind of silence that feels like it presses against your chest. And I did not rush to respond. I did not stand immediately. I just held his gaze for a second longer, letting the moment settle, letting every person in that room feel it before I moved. And then I stood up, slowly, calmly, smoothing the front of my dress with one hand, not out of nervousness, but habit. And I stepped away from the table near the kitchen, each step measured, steady, the sound of my heels barely noticeable against the sudden quiet. And I could feel it now, the attention, all of it, turning toward me, people leaning slightly, whispering under their breath, trying to piece together what they had just heard. And when I reached the edge of the aisle, I stopped, not moving any closer, not needing to, because Michael had already closed the distance halfway. He stepped down from the platform, his posture straightening in a way that was no longer subtle, no longer casual, but precise, deliberate. And then, in front of everyone, in front of his bride, in front of Daniel and his entire family, he came to a stop a few feet from me, brought his shoulders back, and raised his hand in a formal salute, clean, exact, the kind that is not done lightly, the kind that carries meaning. And for a second, no one reacted, not because they did not see it, but because they did not understand it. And then the whispers began, quiet at first, confused, spreading from one table to another, words like commander and military, and who is she, moving through the room like a current, and I could see it on their faces. My mother-in-law's expression frozen, her eyes widening just enough to betray the shift. Emily's smile gone completely now, replaced by something sharper, something uncertain, and Daniel, still standing where I had last seen him, looking at me in a way I had never seen before, not dismissive, not distant, but searching, like he was trying to reconcile two versions of the same person and failing. And I returned the salute, not exaggerated, not performative, just as it was meant to be, controlled, respectful. And when I lowered my hand, the room did not return to normal. It could not, because something had already broken, something they could not undo. And Michael exhaled slowly, a faint, almost relieved breath, like a question he had carried for years had finally been answered. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, no longer uncertain, but certain, grounded. "I thought I recognized you," he said. and the way he said it made it clear that this was not coincidence. This was not a random guess. This was something real, something that reached beyond this room, beyond this moment, and for the first time that night, I could see it clearly. The exact point where everything they believed about me began to fall apart. I remember the exact moment the room stopped breathing, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that felt like reality itself had been paused. After Michael lowered his salute, he did not return to the ceremony. Instead, he stayed standing a few feet away from me, his posture still formal, still controlled, but his expression had shifted into something more focused, like he was no longer looking at a guest at a wedding, but at someone whose presence changed the meaning of everything in the room. The officiant stood frozen behind him, unsure whether to continue. Emily was still holding her bouquet, but her hands had begun to tremble slightly, and Daniel was now fully turned toward me, his face tighter than I had ever seen it, as if he was trying to solve a problem that refused to make sense. And then Michael spoke again, quieter this time, but clear enough that it carried across the silence. "I did not expect to see you here," he said, and there was something in his tone that was not surprise anymore, but recognition mixed with disbelief. And I finally spoke, my voice calm, steady, almost too calm for the situation. "It has been a long time," I said, and that simple sentence seemed to land heavier than anything else that had happened so far, because it confirmed that this was not a mistake, not confusion, not coincidence. And Michael nodded once, slowly, like he was confirming something internally, and then he turned slightly toward the guests, as if remembering where he was, as if suddenly aware that hundreds of eyes were watching every second. And he raised one hand, not in command, but in a quiet gesture for patience. "We will pause for a moment," he said to the officiant. And the officiant, visibly uncertain, simply stepped back. And that is when the whispers grew louder, no longer contained, moving across tables like waves. I could hear fragments of words. "Military, she is someone important. Commander," and I could feel the shift in the room, the way people who had ignored me minutes ago were now studying me, as if trying to rewrite what they thought they knew. Emily finally stepped forward slightly, her voice careful, forced polite. "Michael, is everything okay?" she asked, but he did not answer her immediately. Instead, his eyes stayed on me, and then he said something that changed the temperature of the entire room. "Yes," he said, "it is just unexpected." And then after a pause, he added, "Commander Carter saved lives under my command." And those words did not land gently. They dropped into the room like something heavy, and I saw it happen instantly. Confusion turning into shock, shock turning into disbelief, and disbelief turning into something far more uncomfortable for them. Understanding, Daniel took a step forward, as if he had misheard. "Commander," he repeated, his voice lower now, less certain, and I turned slightly toward him for the first time that night, fully looking at him, and I could see it in his eyes, the attempt to reconcile the woman he had placed near a kitchen door with the name that had just been spoken in a tone of respect. And I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply said, "You never asked what I do." And that was all it took for his expression to tighten further, because it was true, not hidden, not secret, just ignored. And Michael stepped closer again, lowering his voice so only those near us could hear. "After what happened on deployment 3 years ago, your leadership was documented in after-action reports," he said, and I could feel the room react again, people leaning in, trying to catch every word, and suddenly I was no longer just a woman sitting near the kitchen. I was a story they had never been told, a gap in their understanding they could not ignore anymore, and I saw Emily's smile fully disappear now, replaced with something uncertain, something that looked almost like fear of social consequence rather than understanding, and my mother-in-law took a small step back, as if distance could undo what had already been said. But what struck me most was not their reaction, it was the silence that followed Michael's words, because in that silence, the hierarchy of the entire room had shifted without anyone agreeing to it, and I realized that this was no longer about a wedding, it was about truth finally entering a space that had been built on assumptions. And as I stood there under the weight of every gaze, I understood that whatever happened next would not just change how they saw me, it would change how they saw everything that had led to this moment. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced in years, but for the first time that night, It was no longer the silence of being dismissed, it was the silence of being seen. People were no longer looking past me. They were looking at me, trying to understand what they had misunderstood for so long. And I stood there in the middle of that shifting room, not moving, not rushing to explain, because there was nothing left to prove. Michael had already said enough, and Daniel was no longer speaking at all, his face pale in a way I had never seen before, like every assumption he had built about me was collapsing at once. And Emily no longer looked confident. She looked uncertain, like the ground under her own status had quietly shifted, but none of that mattered anymore in the way it once would have, because something inside me had already stepped out of that old version of my life, and I could feel it clearly, like a door closing behind me that I no longer needed to reopen. The ceremony eventually continued in fragments, but I did not return to the seat near the kitchen. I was invited forward, not by words, but by space opening where there had never been space before. And for the rest of the evening, I noticed something different. People listened when I spoke. They paused before they interrupted. They looked at me with a kind of respect that did not exist before, but even then, I did not mistake it for validation, because I had learned something that no room full of guests could take away from me. Value does not increase when others finally recognize it. It only becomes visible later that night. When everything was over and the guests had slowly left, I stepped outside into the cool air, and for a long time I just stood there, letting the quiet settle into something softer than before. Daniel approached me once, as if searching for words that could undo what had been said without actually being said. But I stopped him gently, not with anger, just clarity, and I told him that respect cannot be selective, not in marriage, not in family, not in life. And that was the first time I saw him truly silent, not out of control, but out of realization. And I did not hate him in that moment. I simply understood that some people only see you clearly when the world forces them to, and sometimes that clarity comes too late to change what has already shifted. In the days that followed, I returned to my work, my responsibilities, my life that had never stopped waiting for me to fully step back into it. And strangely, nothing about my professional world had changed, only the way I now carried myself inside it, more grounded, more certain, more aware that I no longer needed permission to exist fully. I began to understand that strength is not loud, it is consistent. It is the ability to remain steady even when others misjudge you, and I started to trust my own instincts more. That quiet voice that had always been there but I had sometimes ignored in the name of keeping peace, because peace without respect is not peace at all. It is just silence dressed as comfort. And if there is one thing I hope someone hearing this remembers, it is that you are never required to shrink yourself to fit into spaces that were never built with your dignity in mind. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, and step instead toward the life that does not require you to prove your worth in the first place. If this story reached you in any way, I hope you will take a moment to breathe and remember that you are allowed to choose yourself without guilt, that intuition is not something to ignore, it is something to honor, and that sometimes what feels like rejection is actually redirection towards something more honest, something more aligned, and maybe even something more peaceful than you have known before. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Thank you for listening with an open heart. If you feel comfortable, share where you are watching from. And if this resonated with you, consider subscribing, not for the story, but for the reminder that you are not alone in what you feel. My name is Rachel Carter. I am 42 years old, and the message I want to leave you with is this: never let silence from others define the truth of who you are.